you can be like, well, I am justified because this is my view, and it's not just a humor type intuition. The intuition that I'm talking about is different. Look, that's fine, but that's not going to warrant him justification for accepting this view, and that's the point that I've been making. And saying that this sort of intuition stuff is not the same sort of intuitionism that humor is talking about. That's fine. My point was not about intuition. My point was about justification.
Okay, and so the way that I would look at it is that I believe that in itself hits the threshold of sufficiency. And so what he could do is either provide a rebuttal or undercutting defeater. A rebuttal defeater in showing that my phenomenology is incorrect, or an undercutting defeater by showing, like the Mysterian position by Colin McGinn, that there's a problem in the matchup between your phenomenology and external reality. That's what I'm saying. I think his burden is in that. So it seems like we're disagreeing where the burden lies. He's basically, I think the way to look at it is this, FallenGod. I think once I've given that justification, I'm out of no reason to feed her. No one can claim no reason to feed her to me anymore. They have to provide either rebuttal or undercutter. That's my position.
Yeah, so the disagreement between, like, let's say you and someone like Evan is going to be on whether or not the threshold of sufficiency holds to begin with. And if you're assuming it from the outset, well, then yeah, you're not going to be able to like provide some reason for it, given that it's going to be an assumption under the framework of which you're working. But if that's the very thing that's under question, and it's the very thing that you're trying to see whether or not it holds up, well then yeah, just having it as an assumption isn't going to be something that's going to be moving one side or the other, because the starting point that which you have is not one which is, well, one, obviously true. Like most things in philosophy, most things aren't obviously true, which is why people provide justifications and arguments for their positions. And if someone has an assumption under which they use to, I don't know, make an argument, sure, you can work under that assumption. But if someone is trying to target the argument as a whole and is saying, well, look, maybe I don't want to work under that assumption because that's not a view or an assumption that I'm willing to grant, well, then that's perfectly legitimate, and that's a perfectly well dialectical move to make. And that's, look, the point again was about justification, and I think the disagreement is going to be as to whether or not the threshold of sufficiency holds, and whether, and like, look, it doesn't matter what reasons you give right now. My point just still stands. Like, even if you end up being right, that the threshold of sufficiency holds, my point is a meta point. It's not necessarily about the content of the principle, but whether or not, like, the structure of dialectic and how, like, assumptions work and what sorts of criticisms can be offered, they don't need to follow some rigid guideline that you're, like, setting up.
Okay, sure. Let me kind of put this point. So what happens when there's someone like me? And you would understand, I'm more continental, so I use phenomenology. So I'm going to use something like essential intuitions. And when I do that, in my mind, threshold of sufficiency is met. So it's like, if you want to sit there and say, well, I'm just not going to accept that, I'm going to say, how am I going to then have any kind of discussion or debate with you at all when you are from the start eliminating something very, like, basically my epistemological method? So I'm going to rely heavily on phenomenology. And let's just say, as far as the person who's saying music awareness, I'll explain to you what intuition is in the Husserlian sense in another time. I don't think you're understanding. Intuition is not gut feelings. There is a specific method behind it too, the phenomenological and eidetic reduction. But yeah, FallenGod, you would understand the point that if I'm coming in with someone who's not going to just accept these phenomenological justifications, because there are reasons. You do understand. It's not like I'm not providing reasons. You see, I'm thinking the threshold of sufficiency is hit by these phenomenological justifications. Correct?
Look, again, yeah, like, I think that you have reasons to think that it's true, but just because you have reasons to think that it's true and it gives you justification, it doesn't then mean that the other person has some warrant or has some justification in thinking that threshold of sufficiency holds. And that's the point that I've been making. And I said, yeah.
But let me go. Okay, but let me go to this point. This is what's interesting about it. Then what do you think is the difference between someone saying nah versus someone like Colin McGinn, who's actively trying to attack my position by basically saying there is this then problem of your phenomenology to match up to reality? Do you think he's going above and beyond what he has to do, or he's doing what he does need to do? Because he's not actually just sitting there and saying, I don't think you've given sufficient justification. He's saying, I've seen your reasons and I'm going to try to defeat your reasons. So what do you think he's doing differently?
Well, there's a different sort of dialectical structure when he's writing, when he's look, because you said that he was trying to forward a particular view. But look, obviously, if you're trying to forward a particular view in a certain, dialectical space, you're gonna need to do more than just say that a certain position doesn't hold. You're gonna have to provide reasons to think that your position holds, and then maybe talk about certain, theoretical virtues or that your position has over the other position. And sure, you're gonna have to do more work. But if your goal isn't to write a paper, but rather to have a discussion with somebody and they forward a particular position, and you're just trying to ask for the justification for a particular aspect of that position that you're not granting, well, then it's not like a requirement that that person in that debate, in that dialectical structure, that they have to provide some alternative view. I mean, all they just have to do, given at least, the way that the dialectic is formatted, if they want justification for something that they are not taking to be obviously true, well, then the dialectic is going to take form in a way that the person who's offering a particular view is going to have to offer justification for whatever position that it is that they're putting forth, even if they think that the position that they're offering is one that's just obviously true.
Okay, and I guess the way that I would look at it is would push it on to what principles we would agree with or not. Interestingly enough, I've worked on a kind of argument as far as why you should accept phenomenology. So my
My
position,
bad for interrupting. I'm gonna go now, but please don't fight with each other. Whatever, keep it respectful, okay?
sure, okay, Vienna. Yeah, fallen God. So the question would be, and I would then push the burden to you, is why are you not then accepting this phenomenology? Because I would have something like Husserl's idea that I accept originary presentations because they have that immediate phenomenology of givenness. Just as when I go outside and let's say I make the statement, it's raining outside, and I go outside and I see, hear, and feel the rain, I feel justified in believing that. I don't need to give you reasons as to why I'm basically saying it's raining outside when the sight, the sound, and the texture of the rain is hitting me. So in the same way, I would say that as far as essential intuitions as well. When I do this phenomenological eidetic reduction, to me, that's equivalent to basically the sight, sound, and texture of rain. And I don't feel as if I have the need to defend that. I mean, well, that is the adequate defense itself. So I would say that that phenomenological approach is adequate. And let me see if I can find kind of an argument I've worked on a bit for it. It's just at the start, so it's probably not the best now, but let me get something. Oh, no, you can talk. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, my point isn't about whether or not you particularly are justified. Look, again, if you hold to this phenomenological view about your intuition, not in the humor sense, but in the Husserl sense, look, whatever sense that is, it doesn't matter, because the way that justification works isn't that just because you're justified, then in a debate or some sort of discussion that you have with somebody else, that just telling them that you're justified on the basis of this sort of phenomenological experience that you have, it doesn't then warrant them justification to accept the view, right? And like the demand isn't like, okay, Nyklot, tell me why you're justified. No, it's like Nyklot, give me reasons for me to be justified in holding to the same view that you're putting forth, and that's a separate demand. That's like that demand is going to be completely distinct than someone demanding you to be justified, like for you yourself to be justified, as opposed for them to be given justification for them to accept the view.
Okay, well, I'll go to this, and I just got the argument here, and tell me what you think of this. So my point is, I'm going to then say you have a burden. So I'm going to say, look, I'm prima facie justified in believing the type of knowledge that has the phenomenal character of originary givenness. Denying the prima facie justification of fulfilling intuitions, originary presentative intuitions, requires a justificatory basis that is also immediate and self-evident. So it's basically going to say that if you deny this, I need you to provide your, let's just say, justificatory basis that has the immediacy and self-evidence as a, let's say, fulfilling intuition. So the question is, I'll say, okay, fallen God, you want to deny that then? You don't want to accept phenomenology? Go ahead, do this.
Well, no. Well, the denial doesn't have to be a phenomenology. You think when like someone like Merleau-Ponty denies the sort of freedom that's in the phenomenology of someone like Sartre, do you think that they're denying phenomenology as a whole? No, they're denying a particular account. Someone can deny that the particular account of phenomenology that you're putting forth is one that they accept, but nonetheless, it doesn't mean that they have to deny phenomenology.
Okay, fine. That's okay, and that's what I'm saying. So that's the rebuttal. So give me an alternative phenomenological account. That was my whole point of the original argument. If you disagree with this, give me an alternative phenomenological account. I was always open to that.
Yeah, it's going to depend on the dialectical structure. If the dialectical structure is going to be one where the person is offering an alternative view, and it's like been made clear from the outset that you're going to, I don't know, takes for example, if you have a debate between like a theist and a naturalist, and like the like let's say the proposition in debate is going to be like, I don't know, the question is naturalism or is theism true? Well, then yeah, if the naturalist is just saying like, well, you don't have good arguments for theism, and let's say they provide some reasons to think that the arguments aren't good, well, then that's not going to preclude that the naturalists won simply because they didn't fulfill some burden, right? They didn't fulfill the burden to prove that naturalism was a view that like was above or better than the theistic view. But if the debate is just whether or not, like, if it's just like a, I don't know, a theist saying, look, theism is true, and the naturalist is just saying like, okay, what reasons do you have to think that theism is true? And the reasons that they give, let's say, aren't ones that are obviously true and they're contested. It doesn't mean that like the naturalist has some burden to prove naturalism. No, it's just going to depend on the structure of the dialectic. So just putting this argument forth, the one that you put in the side chat, like that alone isn't going to tell me a dialectical structure. It's not going to tell me whether or not the person you're arguing against has to provide you an alternative phenomenological theory of, well, not theory, an account of phenomenology. Like it'll depend if they're making some claim like look, Nyklot, your account of phenomenology is false, but this one like that I hold to is better. Well, then yeah, they do have a burden to prove that. But if they're not making any sort of claim about the nature of phenomenology, but you are, and the claim that you're making isn't obviously true to them, well, then they can provide a criticism without needing to posit an alternative view.
But in this structure, my whole point, I was saying that these originary presentative intuitions, which essential intuition is one of them, is prima facie justified. And so the question is, if someone would contest that, I have this argument to support it. And so the key premise here is premise two. And so I think this is what I'm saying. Ultimately, at some point, they're going to have a burden as well. When I'm saying denying this, if they deny this, they require a justificatory basis that is also immediate and self-evident. So I'm going to say, if you deny this, just tell me what is yours. What is your source of justification for knowledge, which is going to be better than that? That's the idea.
Yeah, I understand that. But you notice how you're building in a particular dialectical structure that need not be held just on the basis of the argument. This is something that you're making that's independent of the argument. You're saying, look, if you deny this, well, then you have to show me this. But that's not a part of the argument. That's a part of the kind of dialectical structure in which you want to represent the argument. And that's perfectly fine. You can do that. But that doesn't mean that in any dialectic in which this argument is present, that that's the sort of format that it needs to follow.
Well, I think it was a fair response. And I guess my point I'm making is this: a lot of this that I'm seeing here in kind of the debates with a lot of you people, it seems as if you're wanting to, and to use an analogy, throw stuff from the sidelines and not enter into the arena. So when I'm saying, okay, you say, like the first part was, okay, I'm just going to deny phenomenology as a source of knowledge. Because you know that my whole point, it's crux of that. I use eidetic intuitions for this, for these essential intuitions. It's core for this. So in these arguments, in these premises, like premise one of that, I'm going to use phenomenological and eidetic reduction to support that. I'm going to basically say that hits the threshold of sufficiency. And if you say, well, I don't agree with that method, then I go to this one saying basically, look, if you deny this, then now you have to actually provide some form of justification which is better than that. And if you're saying, I don't want to do that, then when is the point where you're going to have to step up to the plate? It's not me constantly having to just say, okay, you deny this and I give this reason. At some point I'm saying here, okay, look, here it is. This is where I'm going to stand my ground. So I'm going to say, okay, if you want to just deny this phenomenological outlook, I'm going to go to this argument, working on it a bit. So it's probably not the best yet. People might be able to poke holes in it. But nonetheless, that is the avoidance of epistemic double standards. Maintaining consistency in epistemic standards requires denials to meet the same immediate and self-evident standard as assertions. That's basically it. So your denial has to have that same level as the assertion, which is the fulfilling intuition. And that's my point. And if you want to then deny that, it doesn't seem as if you're playing the game. It seems like you're from the sidelines throwing stuff.
Again, that's fine. You can build that into the dialectical structure in which you want to run the argument. But the claim, or the sort of claims that I've been making still stand. This is going to be something independent of the argument. This is something that you're going to be trying to enforce given the dialectical structure where you have a sort of back and forth with a particular, interlocutor. But the person, and again, you made the claim initially in your last remark that the denial is of phenomenology as a source of knowledge. That need not be made. They may, like I said before, someone like Merleau-Ponty who denies a sort of freedom that someone like Sartre has in their phenomenology. They need not deny freedom, nor they need not deny phenomenology, because they don't actually deny them. They just deny the particular account that Sartre has of phenomenological freedom. Again, someone can deny that your particular view of phenomenology isn't the one that they hold to. And it depends on how they make the claim. If they say, look, Nyklot, your view is incorrect and my view is right, well, then yes, they have a burden to show that the alternative phenomenological account that they have is going to be one that's true, or one that's more reasonable to hold to than yours. But if they just make a criticism, and depending on the structure of the dialectic, if you're just saying, well, this account is true, and then they just ask, they have some criticism or ask for a reason for why, for them to be justified, well, then they don't need to provide an alternative account, because it doesn't mean that they denied phenomenology as a source of knowledge. It just means they denied your particular account to be one that they hold to be obviously true.
I think in this sense, they're going to have to actually provide some form of actual defeater. So you're saying they deny, because I want to understand this completely. Are you saying they're denying phenomenology or they're denying my phenomenology? Because if we go to those 2 points, I can basically then say, if they're denying phenomenology, I think then my kind of argument stands. If they're denying my specific phenomenology, I'm open to that. And I agree with you. Ponti has a different phenomenology than Sardo has a different phenomenology in Husserl. But that was my point all along, FallenGod, that's an adequate rebuttal. If someone sits there and says, look, I disagree with your phenomenological method. I disagree with the phenomenological and eidetic reduction. Here's some problems with it. Here's how I would understand that experience. I'm open to stuff like that because the person is actually then providing a refutation. But I get kind of a wishy-washy thing from you. It's kind of like you're saying, what obligations does someone have given the dialectic? And it seems as if, that's basically I'm getting at. And I guess that's what I'm coming in at. I'm expecting actual refutations and defeaters and not just what do you mean by that and how do you know that? I expect, like, let's say that hypothetical conversation with Colin McGinn. I'm expecting something like that where this person might say, okay, look, Nyklot, you're basically asserting consciousness has this attribute, matter has this attribute. What I'm going to say here is I agree with you, but I don't know that our phenomenology matches up to reality. That's what I'm expecting. I'm expecting people to provide defeaters and not just say, nah. Now, you're saying you see that depending upon the structure of the dialectic, but I'm saying in a dialectic, don't you think the other person should actually have to provide some form of defeater?
Again, I think if you're saying in a dialectic, but you're not specifying what the dialectic is, well, then that the response is just going to be undefined. Because if I tell you like what's infinity minus infinity, well, it's going to be undefined because you have to talk about a specific set of I don't know, the cardinality of the particular infinity that you're talking about, right? So if you're just telling me like generally dialectically, like does a person have a particular burden? Well, it'll depend on the particular dialectic, right? If you're having, let's say, like again, like I said before, a debate between a theist and a naturalist, if the theist initially made the claim naturalism is false, well then now the theist has a burden to provide I don't know evidence and to think that naturalism is in fact false, right? The naturalist doesn't have a burden given that the way the dialectic was structured in that context to provide reasons to think naturalism is true.
Oh, sure.
Right? All they just have to do is just defend, or attack the sort of criticism that the theist is putting forth. But if the theist says, well, look, theism is more reasonable to believe than naturalism, and the naturalist says, no, naturalism is more reasonable to believe than theism, well, then now both of them have a particular burden. They both have to provide reasons or defeaters for the other person's position. And I think that it's just going to depend on the particular dialectic. And it seems like you started to agree with that. And
here's the problem.
That's agreement. Okay, well, then what's the problem? What's the problem with that sort of dialectical structure?
The problem is you get people who are non-committal to quote unquote win a debate. Like, for example, Venus. I'm agnostic about this. And it gets to the point you're really being non-committal in this really dishonest way. Like, for example, you're saying people are afraid of making assertions. Because if you've ever heard of the performative contradiction that someone will give, there are no synthetic a priori truths. Now, that statement itself, they want to show it's a performative contradiction because that statement is neither analytic a priori or synthetic a posteriori. But Venus is like, oh, no. I'm not saying that. I'm saying I've never had one. I'm agnostic about that. And he's going to sit there and say, oh, I'm agnostic about ex nihilo nihil fit. And it's kind of like you get that. And that kind of dialectic I see as dishonest well. Because if you're saying that the person's going to be non-committal, they're going to say, oh, no, like Venus, no. I'm agnostic on that. Nyklot, no, I'm agnostic on that. I think that's dishonest as well.
Well, I mean, again, that's fine. I mean, that's just a point about whether or not you think someone's being honest or dishonest. It has nothing to do with dialectical structure. If someone is just being non-committal to everything they say, well, then it's fine. It's fine that you think that they're being, dishonest. That's perfectly fine. But I mean, that just doesn't bear on what the nature of the dialectic is. I mean, that's not I guess relevant to any point that I've made.
Okay, I'm just saying I would appreciate more if like someone like Venus was like, no, there are no synthetic a priori truths. That's it. Rather than sitting there saying, oh, well, if I say that, I get caught in this trap, so I'll just say I'm agnostic about that. But that was the problem I was having with and hopefully I'm not strawmanning you, FallenGod, but it seems like the way you're saying you're structuring the dialectic is the person is coming at it from a very safe position of being non-committal so they don't have to make any assertions. And you've heard me use this term before. This kind of reminds me of the thing in Buddhism. It's called the Madhavekapika, eel wriggling. It's basically, the Buddha says it's a type of sophistry in which the person doesn't want to make any definite assertions. No, make a definite assertion about something. Don't just sit there and say, if I make a definite assertion here, like for example, if Nyklot is going to some kind of higher principle as to how he's justifying this phenomenology and he's using this argument here, well, I'm saying premise 2 is basically you're going to have to deal with that. You're going to have to make some sort of positive assertion there. You just can't basically sit there and say, I don't know. Yeah, I guess that's the case. I'm expecting in the dialectic the other person to do the example I said earlier as far as Colin McGinn, that person will basically say, no, Nyklot, you're wrong about this. And this is where you're wrong. You can't go from this phenomenological certainty to metaphysical one. Yes, you're understanding consciousness in this way. Yes, you're understanding matter in this way. But that has to do with the sort of cognitive limitations that the human have. That I can respect more because this person has now made an actual statement and he's trying to deal with it. But if the person's always going to say, I'm kind of agnostic about it, my position hasn't really been defeated. That's basically it. The question is, when is the threshold of sufficiency met to whereas you have to one person has to justify it versus the other person has to defeat it? Would you like me to give you an example as far as this is concerned?
Well, I think the answer to that question is just going to depend on which person made a claim that requires a burden to be fulfilled, and that's going to just be the simple answer to that question.
Okay, so tell me what you think of this analogy. Let me give you this example and tell me if you think I'm doing too much or would I have to do this. So I'm talking to Darth Dawkins or Mole or someone, and they basically say, if knowledge and experience, then God. Knowledge and experience, therefore God. I'm sure you've heard that argument before.
Yeah.
Okay, now I would understand that premise 1 has not had the threshold of sufficiency met. Why? Why does knowledge and experience require God? But wouldn't it be better to even go more than that and even defeat it? Sit there and say, okay, hypothetically, let me use Kantianism here. And let's say, what do I need for knowledge and experience? I need space, I need time, I need object, like for example, a fact. When Darth Dawkins brings up a fact. My statement that I always bring up, my cup is red. What I need is things to be spatially extended, I need temporal duration, and I need the category of unity, and I need the category of substance, and I need the category of reality. Then you ask Darth Dawkins, others, where is God in this? Do you see how that's stronger? Right away, you're knocking their claim out, you're defeating it. Now, I do think that in the first place, that person needs to provide an actual, let's say, reason as to why knowledge and experience would require God. He hasn't done that. So you could sit there and say, I think the other person could basically say, yeah, you haven't hit the threshold of sufficiency, but why not from the start just defeat it?
That's just going to be up to the preferences of the person that's like talking to Dart or someone that's making that sort of argument. I think both sorts of criticisms are fine. And I agree, yeah, like if you provide an alternative that uses the same, maybe, I don't know, starting points that doesn't end up with the same sort of conclusion that someone like Darth is making, well then yeah, like that's going to be a stronger position. But that doesn't mean that like therefore that's like the position, well that's the way that people should be having debates. That's going to be something completely separate. That's going to be a normative claim regarding how these sorts of debates and dialectical structures should be, and that's going to be again completely normative, and it's going to be again not in virtue of some, I don't know, part of the dialectic, or it's not going to be about some feature of how dialectics, like, I don't know, naturally are or whatever. Normative just means the way, I don't know, like it's going to be talking about the way things should or shouldn't be regarding some domain, but to the person in the slide chat. But again,
no, I do want to say something, FallenGod. You've been really good in this conversation. It's been fair back and forth. You haven't played games, so I just want to commend you in this, and I'll kind of change my view on you after this conversation. I think ultimately what it boils down to is the threshold of sufficiency. I think we disagree where the threshold of sufficiency lies. And so I guess the question is this: when I believe I've met the threshold of sufficiency and the other person doesn't, what's the step from that? How do we proceed from that? Like, let's say premise 1 of my argument. I've done these intense phenomenological analyses, and I've said I've met the threshold of sufficiency. The job, I believe, is now for you to provide the defeater, and you don't believe that's the case. Well, the question is, how do we proceed from there? How do we really do that?
Yeah, I think it's going to depend on the way that the debate or whatever scenario we're imagining started off with. If it started off with you, let's say you made a claim, and let's say the other person didn't make any claim initially, and then after you made the claim, you try to substantiate it by putting forth your view. If they target, I don't know, your view when they ask for justification for a particular aspect of your view, and then you provide, like, I don't know, reasons to think that that particular aspect of your view is true, and then they ask for, like, okay, well, you provided reasons, but like those reasons are one that are like, I don't know, that they see are like dubious or they don't see like are obvious to them. Well, then, given that dialectical structure, it's going to be like, if they're not accepting it like is not going to be, I don't know, like then demanding from them that they have to provide some argument, even though it would be better and more fruitful for the conversation that they provide some sort of argument. But it's not like a requirement. It's not something that like they need to do. I mean, if like there's reasons that are like not obviously true, like I don't know, in favor of some view or some thesis, well then if they target those reasons, well then those reasons are going to need to be justified. And if they do it infinitely, well then I mean, yeah, then the conversation just isn't going to be going anywhere. And I think that the way that the like it should proceed is to like, well, one, either just end the discussion there, or two, say I don't know, try to make a meta point regarding the dialectical structure, and then say whether or not they're going to defend some view or not. And if they're not, well then you, like someone like you, may not just be interested in having a conversation with a person like that, or you may be interested. I know some people might be interested in having those sorts of conversations.
Well, no,
But I mean,
yeah, I was going to say that. And again, I had this conversation with Marco, and again, you learn from experience. And so, as his point, his analysis, he analyzed the Eric and Evan, and he said Eric tried to get you in a gotcha, failed. But Evan, he said the problem was rhetorically you trying to convince him. But that's the reason after that where I'm like, should I really try to convince him? Because Marco said what you should have done is once you establish your point and said we bottom out here, you remain confident in your point. And he said that would have gone much better for you. So I guess there's a difference between debate and philosophy in that sense, because I'm thinking, yeah, you know what, this is the question. I think this is what's going to happen in these debates after I give that stage. You're going to have people that now believe, given my, let's just say, explanation of this, that they feel that once they've given a sufficiency of reasons, they don't have to provide any more. You're going to see a lot more theists do that. Now, Squiddy, are you there? Would you agree? Because that's what Squiddy got from a lot what I'm saying. He's right now thinking, no, once I've hit the threshold of sufficiency, I'm not going to give any more reasons. Yeah, Squiddy, are you there?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
basically in the discussion, is that what you're kind of convinced of that now, right?
Yeah, more convinced than I was before because, you're obviously what you're doing and, discussions we had kind of led me in the direction of, okay, once I give an argument, then I'm not going to go any further. You have to provide the alternative explanation. I'm not, that's the burden's not on me. And I kind of like, yeah, that's definitely, I feel that more now that I've had those discussions with you.
Yeah, that's just what I'm doing. So that's the change that's going to happen. You're probably going to see a lot more theists say, no, I'm use hypothetically Mason. I've hit the threshold of sufficiency. You provide the defeater. So I think this is going to end now. I think I actually had an interesting conversation with Evan about it, and he said what it's going to do, it's just going to split debates here because you're now going to have theists that are going to use your stage and your ideas, Nyklot, as a way of, and I hope it doesn't happen to this because Marco actually said one comment that Nyklot, people are taking you poorly. And I don't know if Mustafa was intentionally strawmanning me or not, but Mustafa made a point, I think it was in the politics server once. He said, well, Nyklot's saying you don't have to give arguments or reasons. And I'm like, my response was, Mustafa, you fucking dishonest piece of shit. You know that's not what I'm saying. You know I'm not saying that you don't have to give reasons. You know I believe you have to give reasons. This idea that I'm asserting that people can just make assertions without any kind of justification is false. That's not what I'm saying at all. And, from what I heard, talk to Marco later, he might be getting it from other people because some people are now using me as a reason, and I don't want to single out certain theists or Christians for this, to just make assertions and then say that they don't have to give reasons. And they're using, well, Nyklot said I don't have to do. Nyklot's saying this. And I don't want to be known as a misogynist. Misogynist, basically, like hatred of argumentation, that I'm someone who's promoting the idea that you can just make assertions without any justification whatsoever. But I think that's why I was talking to Squiddy about that. But I think Squiddy gets that as well. I was talking to Squiddy that I just want to make sure that this is not the impression people get of me, because that's not what I'm trying to promote at all. And if anything, this stage could then be a good discussion as to where the threshold of sufficiency is. Because I think that's really going to be the key issue when that hits. Because if person A says I've hit it and person B doesn't think they've hit it, well, what happened is person A usually wants to convince person B and will try to go above and beyond. Now, given my, let's just say, explanation of this, a lot more people are going to dig down into what they consider to be the threshold of sufficiency, and they're going to say, "Nuh-uh, not going to." Like Squiddy, you're right. I'm not talking to you. You're going to sit there and you're say, once you believe you've hit the threshold of sufficiency, are you going to try to convince people anymore?
Probably not.
So, FallenGod, what do you think that's going to do for like debate or dialogue here?
Well, I mean, it depends on the debater and the way the dialectic is structured. But if you're providing an argument and then someone asks for reasons to think that, I don't know, a particular premise of the argument is true, and then you say, no, like I've hit the threshold of sufficiency, well, then now you're going to have, like, either the person's going to keep poking you to provide justification for the premise, or they're going to ask you to provide justification for them to accept this threshold of sufficiency. And I don't think that it's actually moving the conversation anywhere. Because if I give you an argument that ends up concluding, I don't know, like let's say, I don't know, I give like two conditions or two premises that are like that are like trivial. Like I say 1 + 1 = 2, 3 + 2 = 5. Therefore, like, I don't know, phenomenology doesn't exist or phenomenology isn't true. Well, you're gonna question, like, okay, well, what's the justification for thinking that, like, I don't know, the premises entail the conclusion? And I'm like, well, no, look, I've hit the threshold of sufficiency. I'm not going to provide further reasons or further justification. You have to provide the defeater. Well, then, I mean, yeah, one way that you can go about responding to that sort of argument is to provide a defeater and provide, like, I don't know, like a view where you can have both of those premises with the conclusion being false. But again, it doesn't like move the conversation insofar, like, that's one way that the person can respond, but they don't need to respond that way. They can just ask me, okay, why should I think that that conclusion follows from the premises? And just saying that you've hit a threshold of sufficiency isn't going to be sufficient to warrant that the conclusion in fact follows from those premises. And I don't know, I just don't see that this is going to be, like, in all cases helpful. Like, it may be helpful in certain cases, but it's not clear to me that it's always going to be helpful.
Well, I kind of made a joke to Evan about this, and I think this is the thing that's going to happen. I basically said, if you look at my argument, it's one big hypothetical syllogism. It says if A leads to B and B leads to C and C leads to D, and eventually A is going to lead to H. Now, the problem is A is not identical to B. When I'm saying experience and I'm saying unified consciousness of self and unified objects, they're not identical to each other. So there has to be some inferential leap. And that leap is done through specific reasons. And the question is when the person believes they've given the sufficient reasons for that. Because if you want to make it so that it doesn't violate the law of non-contradiction, all you're basically is going to say if A leads to A and A leads to A and A leads to A and A leads to A, well, yeah, it obviously is true, but hasn't given any informative. Anything that's informative, there's going to be in statements some inferential leap. It's just that's the case. It's going to be. You would agree. You have to basically have, when I'm saying our experience is this, and I break this down into the logical format of if-then statements, when I'm saying if the antecedent, then the consequent, there has to be some inference that leads from the antecedent to the consequent. That's just the case.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, that's just going to be that. Look, that's just going to be true by virtue of the axioms and the rules of the formal system, right? Like, to have, like, this is just a basic rule in something like propositional logic, that if you have like arrow elimination, which is just going to be one rule of inference, yeah, sure. If you have P then Q and you have P, well, then obviously therefore Q. Someone can still nonetheless press you on whether or not the conditional is true, whether or not if Q actually follows from P, right? Because it could be the case that Q is true and that P is false, or it could be the case that P is true and Q is false, and in which case you have like a false conditional. If someone is asking you, like, the point that I'm making isn't that the person can press you on whether or not the rule of inference you're making is one that's like follows the rules and axioms of a formal system. That's not what I'm pressing. The issue that I'm raising is that one can still press you on whether or not, like, the conditional itself is one that holds, regardless of whether or not they accept that. I mean, they should accept nonetheless that the conditional is just going to be like going to be a rule in, I don't know, something like propositional logic, predicate logic, that just holds by virtue of the rules of that system. But it's like whether or not, like, the particular inference you want to make from the content of the argument, the particular antecedent and the consequence, whether or not that holds. I mean, that's going to be a separate point that, like, they're pressing that doesn't need to hold regarding the general inference rule.
Well, I'm just talking about the inference more from just if I boil down a premise to just if A then B, what makes the leap go from A to B? And that just can't be reduced to just specific logic. There's going to be some kind of material principle or some group of reasons that make it so that you say, okay, now I have A, that means B is true. That's the idea. That's what's going to need to happen.
Well, yeah, that's if you've like shown that the conditional is like a true conditional.
Well, oh no, okay. So my question is, I'm talking about the way that I'm structuring it. So when I'm saying my argument is just one, as I said, one big hypothetical syllogism. So the point is, when I am saying if A leads to B and B leads to C and C leads to D, all this stuff, the question is what's tying in A and B? What's tying in B and C? What's tying in D and E? That's the whole point. And that just can't be reduced to law of non-contradiction. That's where the threshold of sufficiency is met. I'm saying, okay, if I give these list of reasons, okay, A ties into B. Case closed. That's it. You provide the defeater. And I guess that's where people are gonna disagree on, where the threshold of sufficiency lies. Now, I think the problem is this. I talked to one time Rose about this. I don't know if you agree. She believes that people like Mason exploited this to the point where it became ridiculous. So she thought that some degree of semantic analysis or asking for arguments was okay, but she's upset at people like Mason, whom she believes basically exploited this, really made a mockery of this, because he would basically, in videos with Tart, well, what do you mean by central and central point? Or what do you mean by thrust and thrust of your argument? Or M. Kissinger asking somebody when he says, well, would a census be an example? What do you mean by would? And it looks silly, because if you go to a restaurant and the waitress asks you, would you like ketchup with your fries? Would you ask her what the definition of would is?
Oh, no.
And I think, so do you admit that a lot of atheist debate bros have done that? Especially Mason was really notorious for really kind of playing those games. Doing the whole Jordan Peterson there. What do you mean by do? What do you mean by you? What do you mean by believe? What do you mean by God?
Well, I mean, it would depend on the particular debate or discussion that he had with somebody. That I'd be able to make that sort of, I don't know, analysis. So whether or not he's just making, just like, I don't know, just asking questions that are irrelevant. But at least from my experience, I don't think that I've seen him ask like irrelevant questions, or just questions that like are going to be irrelevant to the discussion.
I think the difference, if I would go back to my discussion with Eric and Evan, I think Eric was running a script. I think clearly there was a conceptual grasping of what capacity, power, and ability was. I think he was being silly and ridiculous in this. Evan, on the other hand, if I'm going to be charitable, I think it was just a difference as far as that threshold of sufficiency. I think I didn't articulate myself as well as I should. I should have basically said, and talking until later, I said, look, Evan, I would say, look, these phenomenological analyses are adequate justifications. That's it. And I said, given these phenomenological analyses, if I understand consciousness as this, and I understand matter as this, and then I understand, basically it would be this. If I understand consciousness as having intentionality, if I understand matter as having solidity and extension, if I also understand materialism as reductionistic metaphysics, then consciousness arising from matter would be strong emergence. And with strong emergence and reductionism, that would violate ex nihilo nihil fit, and ex nihilo nihil fit is true for me, therefore not going to happen. And then that's it. And I don't know, I forgot what he was trying to ask me which one it was, but I just reduce it to just a phenomenological analysis. That's it. This is how it appears. This is an essential intuition. And that's it. I don't need any further justification than that. That's where I end. That's where I'm going to bottom out. There you go. If you disagree, provide an alternative phenomenological account, or possible do the column, as I said, the column again route, the Mysterianism. Okay, but then that really would refute materialism. I really wouldn't consider Colin McGinn a materialist. I would consider him more of a pan-proto-psychist. Because if the concepts are wrong, I would, because materialism to me would only make sense as things are solid and extended, in motion. That's it. If somehow, in some way, we're not grasping the attributes, but consciousness is somehow in it in a way that we don't understand, I just understand that more as pan-proto-psychism.
Yeah, that's fine. But I think the discussion has moved along to, I don't know, a point that I'm not really interested. I think
Okay, cool.
you've come to agree, at least the points that I've made regarding dialectical structure and where the disagreement's going to lie, namely in the whether or not the threshold of sufficiency holds.
Exactly, and that's basically what I'm going to focus on in this. I'll try to be a little bit nicer to people, won't target them. I'm just going to make these ideas. I don't know how Darth Arianis is going to handle that. I think he's a little bit more upset than me, so plan on getting his ire.
All right, that's fine.